initiative designed to provide intentional leadership training and education to individuals. Journey is accompanied by Ally Social, a monthly networking event, and Ally Speaks, a monthly speaker presentation, all in an effort to engage and further develop African Americans in Mansfield and Richland County. As always, we would like to recognize and thank our sponsors, the Richland County Foundation and First Energy, for their continued support of the Ally program. Our webinar today is presented by Renee Thompson, who is the founder and CEO of Unlimited Potential for Achievement. And she is joined by our guest, Dr. Sabrina White, who is serving through the AmeriCorps Vista program with our organization for 1 year, and we are glad to have her. Renee?
Well, thank you, Leona, and welcome to our session entitled Emotionally Intelligent Leadership, Temperament, and Resiliency and Grit. As one of the founding members of Unlimited Potential for Achievement, I know that we are committed to the work of organizations such as NECIC. Our mission is to unleash the unique capacities for achievement that are embedded within today's diverse workforce, to enhance the probability of personal success and increased organizational profitability. Having conversations regarding leadership development are particularly important within business as well as within our communities. And of course, we talk about those things, particularly in these sessions, as it relates to diversity and how we define diversity. Secondly, one of the reasons why NECIC has chosen to focus upon African American professionals is that NECIC is committed to those individuals finding their voices within the workplace and within their communities. Well, one of the things I always like to do is to go back to Webster's dictionary as a resource to kind of get us all on the same page in terms of definition. So when we talk about diversity, Webster's defines diversity as the condition of having or being composed of differing elements, variety especially. So again, what this really speaks to in our culture and our communities is that when we think about this as it relates to African Americans, according to a recent study by the Pew Research Center, 49% of African Americans feel that they have been treated unfairly in hiring, pay, or promotion. Another 59% say that being white helps people's ability to get ahead. And then lastly, about 75% of Black adults say that being Black is very or extremely important to how they feel about themselves. A significantly lesser percentage, 15% of whites say the same about being white. So what this says is that if there's a general feeling among those of African heritage of the importance, the impact of being Black in America, then clearly it is important that their voices be heard and their voices be developed in such a way to lead us to greater unity and more equity. Our objectives for this particular session are as follows: to offer a broader definition of diversity that goes beyond demographic diversity. Secondly, we want to examine how the 3 diversity types can impact leadership. Additionally, we'll discuss emotional intelligence and how it impacts leadership performance. And then finally, we're going to facilitate a discussion on how emotional intelligence, cognitive and experiential diversities, how they impact leadership. And we're going to discuss that with our guest speaker, Ms. Dr. Sabrina White at NECIC. So I'm very excited. This is going to be a great program. So as we go along, please feel free to send in your questions. And now let's go ahead and get started with the first segment of this program. So, first of all, in today's session, we're going to talk a little bit, as you can see from this slide, about how there are 3 different types of diversity that shape our identities. And as you can imagine, most of us actually identify by the first class, which is demographic diversity. So basically, demographic diversity, or sometimes I say census data, really speaks to what people see, and that's typically how we tend to identify ourselves. Demographic diversity is tied to our identities of origin, and there are characteristics that classify us at birth and that we carry around with us for the rest of our lives. It's important to understand that even with these characteristics, their meaning is subject to our interpretation and or perception. So what do I mean by that? Well, many of us will remember Rachel Dolezal. She was the white woman who identified as an African-American woman. Now, clearly from birth, she was born as a Caucasian woman. However, her identity, her heart, her spirit, according to Ms. Rachel, speaks to the fact that she really identified and aligned herself most closely with the African-American culture. Or what about Kris Jenner? He's another example where his hormones clearly identified him as a male, but again, very much like Rachel, his heart and his spirit identified him as Caitlin or as a woman. So demographic diversity, just keep in mind, is tied to our identities at birth. These are the identities that typically, though we may interpret them different, we may perceive them differently, these are the identities that we're actually born with. Now, in the next column, you'll see cognitive diversity. And cognitive diversity speaks to how we approach problems and our perspectives about the world at large. So this sort of diversity really becomes very important in business as well as in our personal lives, because we need people who have differing perspectives, differing ways of approaching problems. Cognitive diversity can be influenced by a number of different things, such as temperament, strengths, and personality. However, cognitive diversity is one of those types of diversities that we typically don't talk enough about, but actually is even more significant than our demographic diversity in some ways. So the question becomes, if this is true, why aren't we, or why is it so important to embrace cognitive diversity? Because each of us has a tendency to look for someone who conforms with our own existing beliefs. This is called confirmation bias. And confirmation bias tends to limit creativity and narrows perspective. Cognitive diversity is not only something that needs to be embraced, but it also needs to be nurtured to promote business and community growth. And then in our last column, we have experiential diversity. Now, experiential diversity encompasses differences in our values, our education, our societal experiences. Why is this so important? Because by bringing our experiential diversity to the forefront, we can avert certain landmines and social faux pas that come from being tone deaf. It can actually enhance our abilities to be empathetic and more understanding of people different than ourselves. So what are some examples? Remember the marketing faux pas that was made from the clothing retailer H&M several years back? An image appeared in their online store catalog of a Black child model wearing a hooded sweatshirt that read, "Coolest monkey in the jungle." Well, as you can imagine, that met with all types of resistance and anger from the African-American community. And as a matter of fact, even many Caucasians were very incensed and offended by that type of display. What's interesting about that is that the marketing of that sweatshirt was so totally insensitive to the history and the stereotypes of Blacks as being labeled as monkeys during the Reconstruction era. Had there been more diversity of experience and even more cognitive diversity to draw upon, perhaps this misstep could have been avoided. So one of the things I like to do is to show this illustration that we put together that really speaks to something that I think most of us already intuitively know. Each of us knows that we're much more than we're much more than the demographic characteristics that we present. Typically, when we see one another, we judge with each other a new person that we meet within 7 seconds of seeing that individual. So we size them up and say, this person is African American, appears to be male, appears to be maybe a millennial. Let me listen to how this person sounds. Well, this person sounds to be educated. So we make assumptions about that individual very quickly. Our identities, however, are much more, as I've been saying all along, than just our demographic diversities. First of all, often we have thought of our identities as merely being one identity. So oftentimes we box each other up and we'll say, well, this person's an African American, and oh, well, that person's a she, and we kind of limit it to that. But actually, each of us has more than one identity. And that's the point of showing this illustration. That yes, we are those demographic characteristics that we've described, but when it comes to our being, we're several layers. In other words, we have several layers, several different identities that we draw upon. So how can we know what do we bring to the table and how do we understand ourselves more fully? So as we look at this illustration, you see that, again, as I said, the tip of the iceberg is our demographic diversity. But as you look at this illustration, there's also cognitive diversity, which lies beneath the surface, and as well as experiential diversities. And experiential diversities speak to the deeper aspects of who we are. And you'll notice along with the experiential diversities, it speaks to, for example, economics, community, social standing, what's our place in society, education, what sorts of traumas have we gone through? All of those things inform the next layer, which is our cognitive diversity. It informs our perceptions, it informs how we process problems, it informs how we approach the world. So what are ways that we can begin the process of understanding and actually diving into that proverbial know thyself so that we can know ourselves and be true to who we are? Well, there are a number of assessments that are available to us that you can use online, and many of them are have a nominal fee, if any fee at all. And this is certainly not an exhaustive means of beginning to understand who you are. This is certainly not an exhaustive means of doing that. But these are several types of ways that we can actually look at how do we delve into really getting to understand who we are. So the first one I speak to is mindfulness meditation. Now, some people might hear that and think, oh my goodness, she's talking about yoga and she's promoting something that's out there in woo-woo-woo land, not even trying to hear all that. But the reality is that there has been a lot of attention that's being focused on this type of programming of mindfulness meditation. And that has actually increased in popularity recently. And it really speaks to the state of becoming aware. Mindfulness meditation is a way of facilitating or optimizing that awareness through an activity that is just mindfulness, and it is the activity of meditation. And before dismissing that idea too soon, let's just consider some of those people that we look to that actually have used mindfulness meditation. People like Oprah Winfrey. LeBron James swears by this as a means of helping him play basketball. John Legend, all of these celebrities, and there's plenty more that I can cite, speak to the practice of mindfulness meditation and how it has helped them in their own careers as well as in their own personal lives. Research has also proven that mindfulness meditation does a number of things for us. It increases self-control. It also enhances our self-awareness, which is what I spoke to earlier. It increases us an awareness of our emotions, of our thoughts. Sometimes it brings to mind some of those experiences that maybe have made us feel uncomfortable. It's a way of processing. Another aspect of mindfulness meditation is actually been shown to increase focus. In fact, researchers are seeing that this is an amazing tool to be used in classroom settings to help young students actually learn how to self-regulate as well as becoming self-aware. Another tool that's additionally very helpful in just getting a sense of who am I and what do I bring to the table is the Myers-Briggs Temperament Index. Now, what this does is an assessment that helps to identify temperament style. So, for example, whether you process as an introvert, for example, or an extrovert, or sensing or feeling. Why is this information so useful? Because it gives one insight as to how they process information from their environment, how they feel most comfortable in understanding and making sense of the world around them. So for example, our former President Barack Obama is known to have scored highly in terms of being an extrovert. And what that meant was Barack Obama processes information internally first before he shares that with information with others seeking their opinions. And he looks to derive his solutions internally and then starts to gain the input of others and the perspective of others as he moved out to form his public policy initiatives. And it's important to understand that there is no right or wrong type of temperament. What this speaks to is just differences of individual. So for individuals, so for example, whereas Barack Obama, as I said earlier, was an introvert, one could look at former President Bill Clinton, and he's a perfect example of an individual who actually draws his energy, draws his strength from being around people and sharing and talking out ideas first. So is one style better than another? No. Susan King, actually, Dr. Susan King wrote a book regarding introverts and actually showed in her writings that introverts are among some of the world's greatest leaders. We often tend to box leadership and have these certain characteristics, and we're going to talk about how that relates to leadership and moving forward and helping people. But many times people tend to think of leaders as those individuals who are very people-oriented, very extroverted. And that's not necessarily so. Some of our greatest leaders have been those individuals who were very much introverts, very much those individuals who processed internally before outwardly manifesting the ideas and the visions that they had. Another tool that's really helpful is a tool called Strength Finders. And I'm sure many of you have heard of this tool, Strength Finders. It's an assessment that identifies those talents that come naturally from an individual and that she is born with. So this assessment tool identifies what they call 34 themes that describe different types of characteristics, such as being an activator or being an arranger or connectedness, etc. This is not a personality test, but rather it's an assessment that measures potential and performance. The originator of this tool, Dr. Donald Clifton, he's an American psychologist. He actually developed this tool over a period of several decades after studying not just American leaders, but leaders across the globe to start to pinpoint what were some of those themes or characteristics that seem to be common in many of these leaders. This assessment is a tool for pointing people to develop their strengths and not to focus on their weaknesses. And I think this is an important distinction to be made, because many times, whether it's in school or whether we talk among our friends, we'll talk about our weaknesses and say, oh my goodness, I really need to be better at mathematics. Well, the premise of Strength Finder says it's great to be aware of our weaknesses, but really what makes one great is to focus in on what one is strong at. So for example, when I think about, for example, some would say he's arguably the greatest basketball player we ever had, and that was Michael Jordan. One of the strengths he had from way back, he was always athletic. Now, there's folklore that says that he wasn't the greatest basketball player there ever was in middle school and high school, but he was athletic and he had an incredible drive. One of the characteristics, he's extremely competitive, and finally he had an extraordinary work ethic. So all of those qualities allowed him to hone in on, you know what, I'm not a great basketball player now, but I'm going to be, and I'm going to beat you. That was his whole ethos. That's the way he believed in himself. And again, many say that he is arguably the greatest basketball player we ever did. So that just speaks again to, he played to his strength. He wasn't trying to be a scientist. He understood that one of his strengths was that he was physically very athletic. And he didn't just stop there though. He didn't just assume, okay, I'm athletic, that's the strength, that's all I need. According to Strength Finders, is once you determine and find your strength, then it's important to develop that strength. So if you're a person that's a learner, for example, it's not enough to say that, oh my goodness, I'm a learner, so that must mean I'm smart. No, that strength has to be developed. So that means you continue to read, you continue to question, you continue to explore, so you can develop that strength even more. Another assessment tool, similar in terms of defining strengths, but this actually looks at character strengths, is called Values and Actions Inventory, or the VIA inventory. And what does this look like? This is a ranking of 24 character strengths that make up our personality. Some of those characteristics are described as, like, say, for example, transcendence or courage or wisdom or justice. And these characteristics, these 24, are ranked in order of our strengths. So very similar to Strength Finders, this assessment is designed to help an individual build upon their character strengths rather than their weaknesses, and look at how they can utilize those strengths for a personal good as well as a broader good. And then lastly, one of the assessments that I will describe is called DISC. Many businesses actually use the DISC assessment, and it's a widely known assessment tool in corporate America. One of the things I always find interesting is that you don't often hear what the acronym stands for, so I'm going to share that with you. That DISC actually stands for dominance, influence, steadiness, and conscientiousness. So this assessment tool measures behaviors and patterns of behavior, and or how people just naturally prefer to do things. And this speaks to some people, and you'll notice this in the workplace, some people just naturally tend to have a take charge attitude. If there's a meeting going on, they'll be the person to share an idea, who'll get the meeting going and flowing and start things up. That's that dominant factor going on. Other people may not be quite as dominant, but maybe they're more influential. They may be that individual that works behind the scenes and says, you know what, here's an idea that's on the table, and I think that if you and I partner together on this idea, we can really create something that's transformative for our organization. That's that level of influence. And then there's always the person that you can rely upon. That person that's conscientious, that is detailed, that dots every I, crosses the T, or not. There's some people that aren't detail oriented, but they are that person that if you need ideas, if you need vision, if you need motivation, they're that person that you go to. So again, this assessment tool measures behaviors and patterns of behavior, and it looks at how we prefer to operate. And this is really important in the work setting because we tend to want to be our authentic selves, and we tend to want to behave in characteristics that we're most comfortable with, and behavior patterns that we're most comfortable with. So by becoming aware of how you naturally prefer to approach tasks, you actually get a better handle on how to work with others whose preferences may differ. So at this point, we've talked about 3 different types of diversity. We talked about the demographic diversity, which, as I said, is the tip of the iceberg. That's what we're most familiar with. We've talked about cognitive diversity and how cognitive diversity speaks to those things of how do we problem solve? How do we interpret data? What are our perceptions of the world around us? What's our temperament like? How do we take data and how do we process it and massage it to mean something to us? That's what we think of when we're talking about cognitive diversity. And then finally, we talked about experiential diversity, whether we're talking about economic diversity in terms of our experiences. There are some of us who've been blessed to have a lot. There are those of us who have not been so blessed in terms of monetary assets. Then our experiences within the community. And this is really important, particularly to this audience of African American professionals. What do our experiences tell us? And then what thoughts, what feelings do we bring to the workplace because of what we've experienced? So if we've experienced different types of racism or sexism, if we've experienced those things, that will inform how we interact with other people. Social standing. Bridges Out of Poverty was an amazing tool and program that spoke to how when people are of different economic stature, how that impacts how they'll interact with others, but also how they'll see themselves. And then, of course, education. And education, when I talked about education as it relates to experience, it's not just going to a university. It's not just going there, but as a person traveled, had they been over to a country other than their own? My goodness, what about going to a state other than the state of their birth? Many people haven't even been outside of their own state. So what is their educational status for experience like? And then trauma. I wouldn't want to neglect to talk about the fact that many of us have experienced and have been deeply impacted by trauma in our lives, whether it's trauma that's been the result of poverty, whether it's been trauma because of maybe some sort of economic disparity or social disparity, or maybe the trauma of being bullied, or maybe the trauma of having lost a loved one. All of these things impact and define and mold, just like this iceberg has been defined and molded by the different elements of its environment, the water, the weather. Same thing with people. There are different things that impact and mold who we are as individuals. So I talked about those different aspects of diversity, and all those different aspects will inform how we lead, how we guide people in the workplace, within our own families as parents, maybe within our places of worship. Now what I'd like to talk a bit about is what's called emotional intelligence. And you'll note that I have a website here where you can actually download an article written by Dr. Daniel Goleman. And he is thought to be one of the fathers, one of the gurus of this concept of emotional intelligence. His work started in the 1990s along with several others, John Mayer, who is now at the University of New Hampshire, and Peter Salovey of Yale. They looked at leaders and they analyzed what separated leaders who were just okay versus those leaders that we remember, that we think about. So whether it's leaders in the workplace or like even if we think culturally, you know, many have suggested that we are in a deficit for leadership. And many have pointed to maybe the time gone past of the 60s. If you listen to your parents or grandparents or even great-grandparents, they'll tell you tales of Malcolm X or Medgar Evers or Martin Luther King or the Kennedy brothers. What made us believe that these individuals were leaders? Was it just their intellect? Well, the work of Daniel Goleman and Mayer and Salovey all suggests not just intelligence. We typically, again, like we box people demographically, we also box how we define leadership. So typically we define somebody who's a leader, somebody who's very intelligent, very, very intelligent. So he has to have been educated, very, you know, attractive, very, a great orator, that intangible of charisma. We have all of these kind of characteristics that we put on leadership. But the concept of emotional leadership actually began in the 1990s. And these researchers, these psychologists said that while intelligence is important, that does not negate the importance of emotional intelligence. And Mayer and Salovey actually, they broke down like the 4 domains of what they described as emotional intelligence. They described the 4 domains as identifying emotions on a nonverbal level. So what does that mean? That means that ability to be able to look at somebody and sense, that person doesn't seem to be okay. Maybe that person seems to be angry, or maybe that person seems to be disengaged. Identifying those thoughts or those emotions on a nonverbal level. Another aspect or another branch of this is using emotions to actually guide cognitive thought. So what do we mean by that? Another way of saying that is sometimes people use that word passion. So that way when we're talking about doing things cognitively, it's not just because it's logical, but it's something that drives us. I think a really good example of someone who used emotional intelligence effectively as it related to his work ethic is the individual, the guy Steve Jobs, the former president of Apple. The late Steve Jobs was thought to be just a brilliant man, although he never actually invented anything on his own. But what he was great at was he was great at casting vision. He knew what it needed to look like, and he was effective at being able to bring around him the people that could actually make his vision become reality. And so he used his passion for technology. One of the things that Steve Jobs was very impassioned about was making technology something that anyone could use. So it wasn't a tool of just the elite, but Steve Jobs had the vision that everyone, even people that were of lower income, they could have iPads or MacBook Pros. Now, the other aspect of that, there's a bit of a dissonance because when you look at the cost of his Apple products, it was actually very cost prohibitive to our young people who are in urban communities. But his vision was that ultimately technology would take hold in the world. So another aspect, another one of the 4 branches that these gentlemen came up with was understanding the information that emotions convey and the actions that emotions generate. So what do our emotions tell us? What do our actions say about how we feel? Martin Luther King suggested in a speech one time that if a man didn't have something that he was willing to die for, he wasn't fit to live. So Martin Luther King, you knew that he was passionate about believing in an idea and a thought that transcended who we are as individuals. So you got a sense of his emotions based upon not only just what he said, but what he did. He was willing to die for what he believed in. And then lastly, the ability to regulate one's own emotions for not only just for personal benefit, but for common good. Many of us just succinctly say, that's just growing up. That's just becoming more mature. But many adults in their 50s and their 60s and in their 70s still haven't mastered the art of being able to self-regulate, master and control their own emotions. Goldman was really intrigued with the concept, and he began extensive research on his own. And he actually took what those 4 categories were, and he kind of built upon those and expanded those domains that were originally described. And he identified 5 key characteristics that leaders, that managers need if they're going to be successful as they lead people. So the first one is emotional self-awareness, knowing what one is feeling at any given time and understanding the impact of those feelings upon others. So first in that's a weighty statement, because what that says is, first, I know how I feel and what I'm feeling at any given moment. But also, I am totally aware of how my feelings can impact another individual. And so that's really important, because most people stop with knowing how they feel. Very few people take it to the extra step, which is emotional intelligence. Many people don't take that extra step of being aware of how their emotions actually impact others. He also believes that self-regulation is another domain that needs to be discussed, being able to control and or redirect one's emotions. And this is also the ability to anticipate consequences before acting on impulse. So that's that individual, again, who is just reactive. You made me mad, so I had to cuss you out, right? But when you have the ability to self-regulate, you say, and I'm reminded of a story by Jay-Z, and this was after he was famous, and this was before he got married to Beyonce, but he was seeing Beyonce. He describes a situation where someone that he thought was a friend, a supporter, was actually stealing some of his intellectual capital, if you will. And he was tipped. And so he knew that this individual was going to be at a club that he was going to in New York. So Jay-Z, being the upfront kind of guy that he is, he confronted that individual and said, hey man, I understand that, you've been kind of taking some of my ideas and peddling them like they're yours. Well, he didn't get the reaction he thought he was going to get. The guy started cursing him out. And Jay-Z was stunned. He was absolutely stunned. He's like, you're the one at fault here, and then you're going to curse me out? So Jay-Z pulled out the knife and went back to what he knew. And he proceeded to stab this guy. Now, he was arrested, but he didn't actually go through the trial and all of that. It was dropped. But the lesson he learned out of that was this. He said, you know what? I recognized through this was an awful lesson, that I needed to self-regulate, that I should never let anybody put me in the position of potentially jeopardizing my own future or the future of my loved ones. So he said, rather than do that, I'll never do that again. And to our knowledge, he hasn't done that. But I thought that was an interesting example. Motivation, utilizing emotional factors to achieve goals and enjoying the learning process. Most really great leaders you'll find are learners, lifelong learners. They constantly want to know not only what it is that they're doing, they want to learn and find out what their colleagues are saying, what other people are doing. So these are the people that persevere in the face of obstacles. So motivation is really key. And then empathy is huge. Now, there's different types of empathy, and I'm not going to get into all of that. There's cognitive empathy, there's experiential empathy, but just generally speaking, empathy is that ability to sense the emotions of others. We've heard a lot more about empathy in our current climate because, not necessarily because leaders have had empathy, but some of the leaders that we have seen appear to lack empathy. So empathy is really an important characteristic of leadership. And then finally, social skills, the ability to be able to manage relationships, to inspire others, and to induce a particular desired response from them. Again, when you think about leadership from days gone past, to be able to cast a vision and to get people excited and committed and willing to actually help to make that vision a reality. So, one of the things that Dan Goldman and Michelle Navarez put together was an article that speaks to boosting your emotional intelligence by asking these 3 key questions. This is a way of just distilling this process and, you know, the KISS method, keep it simple. So they posed 3 questions that all of us can ask periodically as a means of just kind of self-evaluation. The first question is, what are the differences between how you see yourself and how others see you? Now, this question is an amazing question if you really take it to heart. Because many times, and when we think about our personal relationships, our work relationships, we tend to see ourselves better or more magnanimous than perhaps other people see us. So say, for example, you know, maybe you're that person that has an attention for detail and you have to have everything right. You may see that as a person who's driven for accuracy and that you're detail oriented and that you've got drive and that you push for excellence. Your colleagues may look at that and say, oh, not so much, you're pretty anal. And you work our last nerve. And you're always judging all the rest of us because we can't conform to your anal standards. So this question is real key. What are the differences? And the only way you get to that, we talk about the 360 evaluation process. The only way you can really get to the differences between how you see yourself versus how others see you is to ask people that you trust in terms of that you trust their opinion. Now, I spoke of a negative thing about being driven and being anal, but sometimes we have a way of being self-deprecating as well. Sometimes we don't see the greatness that other people see in us. You know, what's interesting, I was teasing our guest speaker, and I was sharing with her that as I read her dissertation, I just thought, wow, what a great work. Now, she recognizes that she put a lot of work into it, and she knows that there was a lot of thought, and she's not confused that it's a good body of work. I'm not sure she recognizes the magnitude of the impact that this should have. So from her standpoint, she did a lot of great work. From somebody on the outside, reading the work that she's put together, I think this could be a transformative document if put into the right hands. So the differences between how you see yourself and how others see you. And then next, what matters to you? Now that sounds like a real simple question, what matters to you? But really that will speak a lot to what drives you. Like at the end of the day, you know, I know a young woman, for example, all she wants to do is pay her rent and eat. That's what drives us, that's all that matters. You know, she never talks about her children, raising them well. She never talks about, you know, going to school or doing something in her church or community. She just wants to be able to eat and have a roof over her head. Now, one could say maybe she has no hope. So that begs other questions. Why is her vision so limited? But really discuss what matters to you. And then lastly, what changes will you make to achieve whatever goals you have in life? Because the reality is goals that we achieve don't just happen. I was mentioning our speaker. Her dissertation didn't just magically appear, because she had to invest a lot of time, a lot of research, a lot of communication, a lot of understanding other people's perceptions. She had to invest a lot to get to where she was able to put together a phenomenal piece. So what changes, what sacrifices are you willing to make? And that's really key too. I mentioned Dr. King and the fact that he said if a man isn't willing to die for something, it doesn't have something he's willing to die for, he's not fit to live. That was his way of saying, this is what I'm willing to die for. This is what I'm willing to sacrifice. Some people sacrifice families. Some people sacrifice friendship. Some people sacrifice just time to have fun. But what are you willing to sacrifice to achieve your goals? I mentioned Michael Jordan. If you were to talk to him, Michael Jordan mentioned that when he was in season, he said, yeah, his relationships with his family were jeopardized. He said he sacrificed that. He sacrificed time to have fun. Now, admittedly, when he did play, he played hard in terms of his downtime. But during season, it was all about getting the ring. So what are you willing to sacrifice? And then lastly, before we talk to our special guest, lastly, I wanted to show you just some people who you might not think about as being leaders, but we titled this as Who Do You Follow? You know, who has made an impact on your thinking enough that you want to hear more about what this person has to say? So as you see, the first person I have here is Jay-Z. And most people would actually be surprised to know that Jay-Z is 50 years old. And his birthday is today. So in fact, happy birthday, Jay-Z. If you're out there listening to me, because I think you just should be, happy birthday. He's considered by many to be the greatest rapper of all time. Born in New York City, he talks about how he sold crack in his early teens. He shares very candidly that his mother was aware of that, but they were poor. They needed to make ends meet, so she wasn't going to question. But he later decided in his late teens, as he saw so many of his friends going to prison and or dying, being killed, he later decided that he had two options available to him if he were to continue his lifestyle. Either he would die prematurely or he would go to prison. And Jay-Z said neither one of those options sounded very good. So he decided to change the path that he was going on. And clearly, even in the hustle of selling drugs at the time, selling crack, even in the hustle, he had a business sense. And he recognized he was gifted, not only just in terms of being a rapper, but he was a gifted businessman. Now, some may say that's, I'm kind of construing something there, but the reality was he did very well selling crack. So he decided to take that skill, instead of selling the crack, he decided to change it and say, I'm going to come over to the other side and make this legit, and I'm going to sell my music in the process. Not only that, I think it's interesting to note that socially, he's become more socially engaged, and he's produced a number of documentaries. The Khalif Browder story, for example, or Rest in Power, the story of Trayvon Martin. He's used his power, his voice to leverage. Clearly, the most recent thing most of us have heard about is his role in the NFL and trying to get more viewership for the NFL. Some people have been critical and cynical of his motives, but at the end of the day, he didn't get to be a billionaire for nothing. And he's using his platform to be able to speak to other things. Michael Bloomberg, the next person right next to the picture of Jay-Z, he is worth a whopping $58 billion. And he's very proud of the fact that he's a self-made billionaire, unlike others who claim to be, who got started off $1 million loan from family members. He actually started his career at the security brokerage of Solomon Brothers before beginning his own company. He has a BS in engineering and a master's in business administration from Harvard Business School. One of the things I find interesting about him, a little known fact, is that he actually smoked marijuana, and he talked about how much he enjoyed it. He said it was great. You know, and of course, your negative pundits, they had something to say about that, and they were critical of his candor, but didn't stop him from being mayor of New York for 3 terms. He's also known for taking a controversial approach to stopping crime with his support of the stop and frisk activity. And this was controversial, particularly because of New York with the concern of police brutality. Many suggested that this would be another approach that would be particularly targeted to African American New Yorkers. So he was heavily criticized for that. And then his recent apologies seemed to fall on deaf ears. Currently, he is a candidate for the 2020 presidential campaign as a Democrat. But even there have been those who have been known to be a bit critical, like the recently withdrawn Kamala Harris, who suggested that she had to drop out of the race because she wasn't a billionaire to be able to finance her own campaign. So, you know, leadership doesn't come without controversy is the point. So he was another person. Here's another person I find very interesting because it seems like you've had the courage of his convictions. And his name is Robert Mueller. He was the former director of the FBI, and he was chosen as special counsel for the U.S. Department of Justice to lead an investigation into the role of the Russia interference in the 2016 election. He's had a stellar career. He was in the Marines. He's got a Purple Heart. He's won a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. He worked for 2 different presidents, 2 different parties, George Bush and Barack Obama. He is registered as a Republican, but he says that he's troubled by the current state of our political affairs. Roland Martin is an African-American journalist who was born in Houston, Texas, and is of Haitian ancestry. Though he had a number of controversies, supposedly he leaked the CNN town hall presidential debate questions to Donna Brazile, who in turn leaked those questions to Hillary Clinton. You know, he's had some controversies, but he's also known as being a staunch supporter of African Americans who are Republicans, and suggesting to the African American communities, hey, don't label them negatively, don't call them Uncle Toms. We are all in this fight together. Kim Kardashian is an American media personality. Most people know her from her show, The Kardashians, but she actually got her start on the 2002 sex tape that she had with her then boyfriend, Ray J, that was released in 2007. More recently, she's come to the forefront of approaching Donald Trump to commute Alice Marie Johnson's life sentence. And that happened in June of this year. And she also fought on behalf of Rodney Reed, the Texas death row inmate that was scheduled to die just this past November 20th. She's actually decided to make a change in her life, and she wants to go to law school. And again, some people are critical of that because privilege says she didn't have to go through the same criteria, application process the rest of us do, that she was just accepted into law school. But nonetheless, she decides she wants to use her platform for more significant good. Donald Trump, of course, most people know him as our 45th and current president of the United States. He has a bachelor's degree in economics from Wharton. He basically inherited the family business from his father. He is a Republican currently. His net worth is at $3.1 billion. You know, of course, there's a lot of questions about this president. So is he a leader? Is he not? It depends upon your perspective. And then lastly, Colin Kaepernick. He's an American football quarterback who right now is a free agent that no one seems to want to pick up. Though he played 6 seasons, I was surprised to learn that it was 6 seasons. I thought it was fewer than that for San Francisco 49ers. He's also a political activist. He felt that it was important to be known that the national anthem really didn't speak to all people, particularly how can we sing this in light of the police brutality and racial inequity that we see in our country. He's a biracial man who was born in Milwaukee, and he's experienced a lot of the isms. So these are just some examples of people who may or may not reflect different aspects of diversity, you know, whether it's cognitive, experiential, and or emotional intelligence. And so now I know we've all been waiting to hear, and we're going to do this interview with our guest speaker. And her name is Sabrina White. She is currently working on her PhD, and she's just submitted her dissertation. And she's done. I'm told she's totally finished. I'm sorry, she's totally finished. She works for NECIC, and I am thrilled to introduce her, and I'm going to turn this over to her. So welcome, Sabrina.
Hi, everybody.
Tell us a bit about yourself.
Wow, that's a loaded question. But for the most part, I am from the southern states of the United States, particularly the state of Mississippi, which of course, based on that state being a red state, it were the last state, one of the last states to desegregate, and that was by force with John F. Kennedy giving out the initiative and basically told them that if you don't, I'm gonna send the troops down there at y'all. So I am number 9 out of 11 siblings. 10 of them are my actual genetic brothers and sisters. One is deceased, and the number 11 one is actually my nephew that were raised as my brother. I pretty much have a wide array of skill sets ranging from IT, computer science, computer networking, interior design, which of course is a sub-discipline under architecture. I'm an educator, and I also am an activist and an advocate for environmental injustice.
Wow, you have a full plate, Sabrina. Tell us something though. One of the things I found interesting is, as I tie this into our subject today, you talk about being born in Mississippi and how that was one of the last states to comply based upon what President JFK did at the time. Tell us a little bit about how your upbringing in the Deep South, how did that influence your perspective, experiential diversity, beyond just you being female and African American? Tell me how that experience informed your perceptions of how to impact leadership.
Well, it's strange because the light bulb really didn't come on until I were like early, maybe I was around 38, 39, something like that. But and at the time when I was born, it was right after the civil rights movement had kind of lost its momentum, and Martin Luther King had actually died, of course. And desegregation had just happened, and of course I didn't know anything about all of that at that time. But I do remember the small town that I grew up in. You actually could walk uptown, and it was a walk. Everything was walking distance. Where you could just walk uptown to the store and take care of your business. I mean, it was just a normal thing for us to do that, because at the time I don't even remember if we had a car or not, but we got around town basically by walking. And I say that to say I remember some of the signs that said black and white only at the water fountains. Coincidentally, I can really remember back that far. And when I said the light bulb really didn't come on till I was maybe about 38, I started teaching in public school system at a low socioeconomically and academically unacceptable campus. Didn't know that those tags even really existed. And after I got the master's, I realized that that's how the schools are determined to receive funding from the state. And of course, that would mean that those schools that don't perform well aren't getting much funding coming in. And of course, I felt that in my classroom when we were low or didn't have any supplies and things of that nature. So as a part of my master's, I went to University of Texas at Arlington that provided some guidance on basically looking up different areas and how children learn cognitively, and understood that a lot of that area where I was teaching, they grew up near landfills, and that kind of thing impacts kids' cognitive abilities. And what that would mean is that the kids that lived there at that time or now more closer to the present, their mothers and fathers grew up in that area and were more impacted than themselves in their generation. And then of course the grandparents, of course, were the ones that were directly impacted, but it was just a cycle that kept moving down, and that neighborhood was still socio and economically challenged. So after I got the master's, I was trying to find a way in my elective course to be able to help the core teachers in their roles to increase the math and English scores, because kids respond better sometimes to practice versus actual thinking. And even though I went through the research portion of my master's, of course, that didn't necessarily bring the answer or the change that I wanted to see. So I started to look up what else was available to me. I guess you could say I am a bookworm. I'll go ahead and take that tag. It is what it is. But I decided to go back and find some courses in interdisciplinary studies, in which that's where I took a specialty class on the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, and the light bulb started shining so bright. And I was probably one of the older students that were in the room, and realized I grew up in the South, and all this information I don't even know or didn't know anything about it other than lightly touching the surface. And I felt, I don't know what I felt, but it just, I was like, I can't believe why y'all never told us any of this stuff? And of course, I asked my mother, my father had already passed, and her sisters and stuff, and then they just kind of was like, well, yeah, yeah, that was happening, but they still didn't go into any further elaboration on it, like it was commonplace to them. And by that time, I had sent in a application for the doctoral program at Jackson State for urban and regional planning, in which that is the only school in the whole state of Mississippi that offers it. So that was a little bit alarming, not necessarily because I don't want my alma mater to get that, to be heralded for that, but Jackson State is a part of the Institute of Government for the state of Mississippi, so it's held there and without any input from any other university. And I went through that program. Of course, I started picking up additional information about in the social sciences, about how leadership, people in leadership positions were connected to the Frankfurt School of Social Sciences, Socrates, and a lot of those, the newer leaders like Peter Marcuse and his father, and who were all actually members of city planning. And from there, I decided to take charge of a component of city planning, which was the landlessness phenomenon. As of 1984, Blacks were declared a landless people. And in my major, in the doctoral program, it was for urban and regional planning, and the concentration was environment and land use. And so I took on to the climate change component of that, which means that if Blacks don't own land, they have no ability to farm or survival during global warming, climate change.
Wow. That's a lot. Well, no, that's some weighty stuff, because really what you're speaking to is something that's really very basic to survival.
Yes.
You know, I mean, there are a lot of things that we could say that we can't, you know, attract, you know, equitably, maybe a personal jet or a mansion. But to be able to have the farmland that you can eat, that you can provide for your family, that's part of Maslow's law of the basics that you need before you can even self-actualize. One of the things I found intriguing in just what you shared, Ms. Sabrina, is that you talked about being a bookworm and how like your passion really kind of got ignited just because of a class and kind of later on after you've been in the work world for a bit. So one of the questions I have is, tell me what are the different layers that you see of your own identity and how those layers have impacted your perception of your ability to make a difference in, as you say, impacting the landless people of our country.
Well, I am quite self-actualized, like you said, and a lot of it has been just basically from me pulling away, being an introvert from everybody and taking a look at what in real time is happening to me at that moment and what has happened to me in my past. Okay. And being conscious of good, bad, or ugly, whatever it is, and moving forward with the value of, okay, what do you want to do with that? Do you want to continue to be a part of the problem or a part of the solution type of thing? I personally understand the fact that leadership requires you to have a level of personal integrity unknown to most men. And you gotta understand, and in the leadership role, that you may be at some point, if not, you are going to be a sacrificial lamb at some point in your life. You have to be able to accept that. You cannot be afraid to die. And the remedy for that is you should be training somebody as a protege right behind you in case that should happen, but you cannot be afraid to die.
That's some deep stuff. That's some really deep stuff, because you mentioned a couple of things there. You said personal integrity.
Yes.
You also mentioned the recognition that there is sacrifice, and you will probably be the sacrificial lamb. Correct. And you know, lastly, you just mentioned it too about how that there needs to be a succession plan, if you will. Yes. Because there will be your own personal demise, so what happens next? So my question is this, because you beg a question when you say all that. Do you feel like that we live in a time of a leadership deficit?
Yes.
And tell me why.
Well, I were asked that by a white person, another educator pulled me to the side and he was like, I want to talk to you for a minute. He said, do you mind us being candid? And I was like, sure, we can be candid. And he was saying, I understand all of your efforts and passion about environmental justice and everything like that. And he said, but you know, it's a little hard for people like myself. He was talking about himself, to be able to talk to certain Black people because he feel like they didn't like white people. Mm-hmm. And he said, you don't strike me as that type of person. He was like, but I'm just gonna ask you, do you have something against white people? And I told him, well, I'll say this to you, no, I don't have anything against white people, because matter of fact, most of my breaks have come, my biggest breaks have come from white people. I said, but I would not like for a white person to sit across the table from me and act as if they have not benefited some type of way from privilege. I was like, so, I mean, I don't not like white people, but I also would not like for them to treat me a certain way based on what color I am, and knowing full well that they have benefited some type of way. If it wasn't anything but you got a promotion over another black person, or you started off with intergenerational wealth type of stuff like that. I mean, even down to the smallest of anything, you know, you got picked because of your skin color. So no, I don't hate white people, but I also am not gonna allow them to push some type of stereotype or agenda on another black person.
So what I think I hear you say when it comes to kind of just that leadership deficit, it feels like to me, you feel like we're still being kind of stigmatized. Your example was you bring up this gentleman who asked you that question. And it sounds to me like, and tell me if I'm misinterpreting what you're saying, but it feels like you're saying we're still in these silos.
Yeah.
And we're still going through the elementary things, and we haven't moved beyond that. We haven't moved beyond those things to really have a leader that says, cast a different vision. Is that, am I hearing you?
Correct too, and we continued on in the conversation, and he asked me about, did I follow Al Sharpton? And this is what I say after this is no pun or no shade against Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, or any of those other iconic figures in the Black community. My feedback to him was this: it is not that I follow them or don't follow them. After the civil rights movement started losing its momentum, the expectation were for the successors to pick up the pieces and keep it moving, and they have not done that.
Why do you think that's up? Because
Self-sacrificing, they're not.
So do you feel like we've raised a generation of people who aren't willing to sacrifice? Or have we not developed them as proteges? Or is it a combination of both?
It is a combination of both, but as the Black culture, the Woody Lynch letter has already done an extremely disservice to us already.
Can you describe that? Because there may be some people listening to this who have no clue what the Woody Lynch letter is.
For as old as it is, it started as a part of a white slave owner issuing a letter to all the states, for all the people, all of the white slave owners, to let them know you don't have to continue to beat your slaves to control them. You can actually control the mind, and you'll have everything else. And so from that, they of course stricken any type of momentum that the Black family unit could have at that point, because it started to demolish the mindset of the male first, and then all the others that had to watch him started to get fear instilled into them. And from there, the mother starts to show favoritism toward one child or the other. The light-skinned, dark-skinned, Black issue started being more prevalent, and of course that continues on to this day. And a lot of people have gotten so caught up into that mindset that it's almost impossible to bring them back, come back to the light. And one thing you mentioned about how people feel about themselves in the cognitive component is the fact about social capital reform. That's one thing for social capital. Social capital is a system, a web system of how the individual feels about themselves and how you feel about your siblings. And then the next component is how do you feel about your community? The next component is how do you feel about the government and the institutions? All of those tie into each other, into other components of life and how you live, how you value different things in life, and all of that stuff is in disarray. Since 50 plus years ago, since the civil rights movement lost its momentum, the Black culture does not have the desire to even fight anymore. We're kind of just going along just to get along. Like the lady who said that just want to pay her rent. And living minimally is fine too. But live minimally knowing that it's contributing to a greater cause, not just because that's all that's available to you type of thing.
So tell me something, because you said that now we've kind of gotten complacent as a people.
Yeah.
Where does the emotional intelligence, like, we show this slide of several people that could potentially be leaders, and what's interesting is it's very fascinating to be like a John Legend or a Kim Kardashian could be thought of as leaders, and they're celebrities.
They're in the limelight.
So where is that boundary, or maybe boundary is not the right word, but what is different between how we view leadership today versus how we viewed leadership 50 years ago? One of the things you talked about was self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
And that what's different now?
It's a little bit misguided, the motivation. Because I mean, when you follow a celebrity component in a leadership role, I mean, you don't know, are you following them because of the celebrity status, or are you following them because of what they stand for is true, type of thing. And I'm not real sure any of those leaders that you mentioned on in that part of the presentation, I'm not sure if any of them are actually willing to die. I'm not real sure. If I had to answer the question, I couldn't say honestly that any of them are willing to die. That's just my opinion,
And when you say die, do you mean a literal death, or do you mean die in terms of being self-sacrificial?
Die in the terms of being self-sacrificial in any way, even losing everything you got type of thing. I mean, Colin, as much as I love him, I'm not real sure if he would be willing to walk away from everything if it meant leadership, the way leadership should happen. I'm not real sure.
Okay, that's a pretty strict standard.
Well, during these days, what do they call it? Tough times call for drastic measures. I mean, we can't be silent anymore. I don't plan to be silent in my role, whether it's big or small. I will continue to be a voice for the Black culture, for the most part, because of the fact that genocidal numbers of Blacks are looking to die under the looming disadvantageous impacts of global warming. Genocidal numbers in every state.
So tell me something, because when you say that, I think for some people that could feel like, oh my gosh, she's talking about global warming. That's something that won't happen in my lifetime. I mean, and I'm not talking, I'm talking about African Americans.
Right.
That we don't quite get that. And how do you as a leader, because one of the things that we talked about was how impactful that emotional empathy is actually, to some degree, even more impactful than IQ. How do you convey that message in a way that resonates with African Americans to stir them up? And so in other words, that you can convey that empathy, you can convey that this is something like, don't think of this as far off. This is a
Correct,
yeah.
Oh, it's tough. It's on a very small scale at this point. I am, of course, still kind of feeling my way a little bit, trying to figure out how can I reach the masses, to get them to see what I see. Because contrary to popular belief, Blacks don't believe that owning land is the only true indicator of wealth. It has been that, and it is today. If you don't own land, you're not wealthy. It doesn't even matter if you have cash.
What
money.
was that information that you put in your dissertation about? I think it was the top 8.
Oh, right.
That was fascinating.
The 5 wealthiest white people
Yes.
in the whole United States. And we know that there's more than 5, but the 5 wealthiest white people own more land than the entire Black population for the whole United States. Now, what kind of ratio is that?
You know, I never got my 40 acres on a
Hey, we better wake up, because as long as the wealth stays concentrated to that group, Blacks will never come out of it. Never. Even going to the table about the reparations now. They went, they presented a case so eloquently, and this is not to shade anybody on that panel either. They went, and of course,
when they went to Congress.
on Juneteenth, I believe it was, and you know, basically speaking nice and trying to be amicable about it, and it's okay because that's a part of emotional intelligence, right?
Regulations, that's what they
Okay.
say, yes.
And that's fine. But in order to raise the issue where they recognize it, you have to pinpoint down, how did we get here? And city planners have played a role that they are kind of pitching pebbles and hiding their hands. You know, city planners, because they are the ones who have not enforced land reform effectively in the United States. That is one party. You can go to the table about reparations, but you also want to peg institutions and systems that were in place. Those are the things that need to change, and they need to change with the justification that if you don't change it, genocidal numbers of Blacks are going to die because they don't own land. How are they going to be able to farm and produce food for survival?
Would you say that this dilemma is very analogous to what the American Indian went through?
Yes. Now the Indians may be okay. They are fully trained on living on the land. But Black folk have a concept of bigger is better and acquiring material things for themselves to feel like they've made it. We're successful. I got this, I got more than that. You know, none of that stuff is gonna even matter because you're not gonna even have access to water, and you gonna have limited access to food. You know, it's gonna come down to a point to people are really gonna be killing each other over resources.
Well, what's interesting to your point, we've got Flint, Michigan,
Yes.
point to in terms of the lack of drinkable water. And it's now, since then, there have been several other cities. that have
Right.
come
Right. We have a water problem all over the United States, and they're not telling people.
And they're not telling people. That's right. So one of the things I think I hear you saying too, that Doc, I think is just so important is, and this is a proverbial, this goes all the way back to the Hebrew King James, for lack of knowledge.
Correct. The skill set of farming has been lost in the agrarian African American community. We are naturally agrarian-based people. That was a skill that actually is a protected skill in the same way that the Indians survived with their skill. It's a protected skill. So not only have Blacks' rights been violated on deficiencies in land reform, because technically that's monopolization of the land market, they've also had a skill set stripped away from their culture that is a survival mechanism. So those are some components that are on the table that nobody's pushing. That should be like on the first page of that reparations bill.
So, okay, so like if you were starting a reparations movement, it sounds like it'd be very different. One of the efforts, I'm sure you've heard about the Georgetown University. Have you heard about their effort? Just in brief, because the audience may not have heard, that the descendants of Georgetown that were slaves on the plantations in Maryland, many of them were actually sold to Louisiana, as a matter of fact, keep Georgetown University afloat by the Jesuit priests. It's really quite interesting. So now, as a way of repairing that, what Georgetown University is suggesting is that if you are a descendant of those slaves who were sold into slavery to pay for the Georgetown University debt, we will give you an education for free.
That's a good approach.
But you're saying even more that that's a start.
That's a start.
But you're saying that we got to do more than
Oh, we got a lot more to do than that. I mean, to the point to where that is a national reform effort. We have to look at not necessarily getting 40 acres in a mule, because they clearly are not intending to give none of us that.
Right.
It's been how many years since the civil rights movement, 50 plus, and we are still at the same spot. And as Thurgood said when he were defending authoring law, Lucy back in the early, middle part of the 50s, he told them, they asked him about gradualism. He told them that it had been 300 plus years since slave emancipation proclamation, and that was gradualism enough. We're not at any point open for gradualism anymore. We are, it's going to be requiring a radical approach, and it's going to have to be more than giving their descendants some type of education. Thank you for the education, but we're going to need some further action in that. And if, I know we don't have that much time to talk about it today, but I propose an excellent strategy for that in my dissertation, as well as am available to help guide that process.
So, that's a beautiful segue, Doc, because now that is absolutely beautiful segue, because I think what you're trying to do is huge, and it can't be captured in just a session like today.
Right.
But what I want to know is, how can somebody reach out to you to learn more about the work you're doing, and how to, in a strategic manner, actually start to develop a method, a strategy for informing? Because one of the things it sounds like we need to do is educate.
Yes.
Then we need to just kind of get together and get,
To put the document together to be able to propose that to the folk over in Washington, instead of saying reparations because y'all owe this to us. Reparations because if y'all don't do something, genocidal numbers of us are going to die. That's what the approach needs to be. Not saying you owe this, you owe this, you owe this. We know you owe us, but if y'all don't help us, the percentage of blacks in poverty, whichever state you live in, are predicted already by the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. The people in poverty, black, white, blue, green, and purple, are going to be the first ones to go, period. Because you already start out with an disadvantage. You have lack of resources already. So under the looming disadvantageous impacts of global warming, those people in poverty will be the first to go.
So Doc, as we close this, I want you to tell our audience, how can they reach out to you to get more information, to actually speak to you about, like, how do we do this? How do we get our arms around this and our heads around this so that we can start to create a movement? Tell our audience what we need to do.
Okay, you guys, I do have a blog available on Facebook. It is under the name Landlessness, LANDLESSNESS. You can certainly reach me by notifying me through that outlet, as well as you can reach me also at Sabrina Ann at Yahoo, SABRINAHANN at yahoo.com.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Yes, thank y'all for having me.
No, thank you. And thank you, listening audience, for being here. Our next session and our last session for the year is going to be on December 14th. And we're really listening. I'm sorry, I said 14th, December 18th, excuse me, December 18th, 2 weeks from today. I apologize, December 18th. And I'm really excited because we've got a couple of phenomenal gentlemen who are coming back, Christian Lee and Victor Coleman. And we're going to really dig into what our urban Black men have to say. And they're going to tell us why they're feared. So thank you so much, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.